Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome to the third episode of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Today we're talking about women's reproductive rights. During the Gilded Age, women that went into labor often donated their prized possessions. They wrote a will, named a guardian for a newborn baby if they should not live through the pregnancy. So high were the maternal mortality rates that roughly 1 in every 150 childbirths ended in a mother's death. And if you were a poor woman, that number was higher. If you were an African American woman, that number was higher still. To put those figures into context, today, only 1 in every 5,500 women die, or no more than around 700 a year in the United States. Although death is the ultimate sacrifice, many mothers in the 19th century suffered with even worse postpartum wounds, physical and mental, and they never really healed properly. Things begin to change in the Progressive Era for all manner of reasons, some for the better, and some changes we're still grappling with today. And reproduction has such far-reaching consequences for society that any conversation about labor or pregnancy naturally leads us to question about human rights, medical standards, and the politics of gender. Just think about the national debates we have over abortion. How, where, and who gets to make the rules about abortion are almost as hotly contested as whether women have the right to choose or not. And who can forget recent scenes that dominate the power dynamics of reproductive rights, like when Donald Trump signed an executive order withholding funds from international organizations that advise on abortion. Trump was flanked by 7 men when he signed that order. The masculine optics echoed an equally masculine reality, that men make the rules for women when it comes to reproductive rights. There is so much more to this story, however. We are going to delve into the history of the eugenics movement in America, various progressive movements, and the transformation of medical education and practice. And to do this, I am joined by the remarkable Professor Barbara Schneider, who has written a remarkable book on women's reproductive rights in the Progressive Era called Corporal Rhetoric. Professor Schneider is in the Department of English, Language, and Literature at the University of Toledo. And as you can probably tell from the book title, language features prominently in how she understands American history. Feminism is an equally vital theme in her work, and if you have a chance, check out a super book chapter she wrote on Demi Moore's famous nude and pregnant appearance in Vanity Fair in 1991. Today's discussion revolves around the book Corporal Rhetoric, but I have no doubt that we'll stray into contemporary topics that are as complex as they are controversial. Welcome to the show, Professor Schneider.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
What are the major differences that you think a mother would have noticed in childbirth from the Progressive Era, or I should say from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era? What changed in that period?
Well, so I guess I think about the changes in probably 3 primary ways. The first change is probably that change that occurred from childbirth in the home to childbirth in the hospital. Only only poor women and women without much assistance gave birth in hospitals. Women who could afford to had their babies at home. So location is one. By the end of the Progressive Era, and I pin the end of the Progressive Era a little later than most people do. I take us past World War I. But by the end of the Progressive Era, more than 50% of women gave birth in hospitals. So my own grandmother is an interesting study in this. She had 5 children, beginning in 1919 and ending in 1929. She had her first 4 children at home. The 5th one was born in a hospital. So the location shift is a primary change that they would see. They would also see a change in the conception of childbirth, kind of the cultural understanding of childbirth. At the beginning of the Gilded Age and prior to that, childbirth was seen as a very natural part of a woman's life. It was continuous with her life, and giving birth was kind of a feminine rite of passage. Women surrounded themselves with other women, with midwives, and they gathered their friends together before they had the child, because motherhood was not only a rite of passage, but it was deadly. One in 54 live births resulted in a maternal death at the beginning the Gilded Age. So it was a fraught enterprise. By the end of the Progressive Era, this is a medical technological event that is separated from the rest of a woman's life and managed largely by men. Because they had managed to get rid of most women physicians, so attendants, and it was very often obstetrical surgeons that managed delivery in hospitals. So, and very few women were ever surgeons. So location, cultural understanding, and I think the third thing that women would notice about the thing is it moved from being a natural event to a pathological event. So I think those three things would be what people would see differently.
You do a wonderful job in the book of contextualizing the Progressive Era. Of all the historic personalities that you refer to, it seems that Theodore Roosevelt comes to the fore as a key figure. And I've written about Theodore Roosevelt, so of course I'm gonna bring him up because I see him everywhere, it seems. But correct me if I'm wrong. How does Roosevelt embody the era? And forgive the pun.
That's quite all right. I will admit that I descended to puns several times in the book. They're irresistible. So for me, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Roosevelt. There's part of me that has always admired his kind of briskness and his vigor, and what I think of as kind of a deep empathy that I see in Roosevelt. And I also think that he participates in the kind of ebullience and optimism that characterized a good part of progressive reforms. And I also think that he's a perfect picture of a paternalism that pervaded that era. Many times kind of a benign paternalism, or he meant to be benign, but in his blindness to his own privilege and position. So I think he is a man himself who really embodied the conflicts and the cultural tensions of that era. I think he's entirely likable. You can't help but like him, but you also have to be cautious when you deal with Roosevelt. I also think that he really wanted a nation that was made over in the image of himself. And I mean that in a very embodied way. He celebrated the vigor of his own body. He wanted a nation that had a vigorous national body. He celebrated his own productivity. He was tremendously productive as a writer, as well as a statesman and a scholar. And he wanted a nation that was productive in that same way. His idea of conservation was that you gathered things together and held them so that they could produce even more. And so I do think that Roosevelt I think he's the perfect embodiment of that era.
I think that's great. I think there's some further context to add there too, just that he himself lost his wife in childbirth, which is a remarkable bit of empathy that I think you talk about. And the efficiency movement that your book deals with is just fantastic. If we wanted to play 6 degrees of separation between TR and Abraham Flexner, who's going to devise the sort of standards for medical practice, Roosevelt's close friends with Henry Pritchett, who is the head of the Carnegie Endowment, who basically gives Flexner this leeway to devise the standards. What role do you think that does Flexner play in standardizing medical education, and what advances or drawbacks come out of this standardization?
Well, so Flexner was funded by the Carnegie Foundation to produce the Flexner Report. To do this, he went out and examined medical education at a number of universities nationwide. It was really a fairly impressive study that he conducted in its breadth and in its depth. In his report, then he recommends guidelines for how medical schools should be grounded. One thing that he really thought was critical was that physicians be trained in clinical settings. The medical student following a doctor around to homes and sitting at bedsides with patients was an inadequate preparation to practice medicine. So he was very dedicated to, and he was also very invested in what he thought clinical technologies, including laboratory tests, could bring to the practice of medicine. And he wanted to foreground those and to assure that those became an increasingly important part of medical practice going forward. So he wanted physicians trained in that. He also, however, wanted to assure that only medical schools that had access to hospital training and clinical spaces were sustained going forward. And that took a lot of money. And because of that, the women's colleges, most of which were proprietary and didn't have as much access to hospitals. The same was true of the historically Black colleges and universities that trained African-American physicians. They too, for the most part, lacked access to the clinical facilities and the clinical settings that Flexner mandated as part of his continuing education. So it really, really constrained access to medical school for women and for people of color. He did think that there should be some medical training for African-American doctors so that they could serve African-American people. And he thought really what they should teach them was hygiene, because that was what they lacked in medical care. So his own dispositions and prejudices so influenced his findings. On the other hand, training in clinical practice did eventually, not right away, but eventually it did improve mortality rates for women. Mortality rates for women in childbirth didn't go down during the Progressive era. Infant mortality rates went down. Women's mortality rates didn't really start going down until the introduction of sulfa drugs, like in the 30s. So they didn't do much to improve medical care for women. They did a better job of saving babies, which was their primary goal. Women were always saving women was secondary. You saved the babies.
I have to say that some of the standards that I read about seem absolutely contrary to reason today. And I can't imagine they would make any sense back then. Male physicians were told not to look at women's undressed bodies or to have conversations with women about their symptoms. I mean, how did a doctor diagnose women?
Well, and so a lot of that was preceded Flexner's report. Well, there were modesty conventions. And so in order to protect a woman's modesty, so if they did an examination of a woman's body, they did it while she was fully clothed. And they would ask her to tell her story, but they didn't ask after specific symptoms because it would mean she had to, name body parts, God forbid. And so they mostly went, and you can read this in some of the early case histories in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. They mostly went by what her face looked like. She had a collapsed look, must be an ectopic pregnancy because she had a collapsed look. So women physicians at that point actually had an advantage because women physicians weren't constrained by the same modesty conventions because a woman could talk to a woman about precisely what was going on with her body. And a woman could look at another woman's body without there being any violation of modesty conventions. That's why midwives were commonly used to deliver babies because they understood how a woman's body worked in ways that many physicians just did not.
I think the machines and the medical equipment that you mentioned are really important to bring up now too. It seems a good segue, especially because you mentioned in the book the machine that goes bing, which is of course a reference to Monty Python, The Meaning of Life. How do these technological advancements change childbirth, both in terms of the act of giving birth and the way we consider it as a natural human event?
So medical technologies are just emerging at that time. Some of them had been in play before. They had stirrups of various kinds going back, but what we recognize today as the gynecological stirrups that are screwed into the end of an examining table, where a woman is supposed to just automatically assume the position, became very popular during that era. And they, in many ways, so they changed the position a woman was in when she gave birth. Birthing chairs had been much more common, where a woman actually was in a crouched position as she gave birth, or she was held by, she had women holding her from behind in kind of a sitting position, and women in front of her that helped deliver the baby. So the bed equipped with stirrups put her in a prone position with her legs up, much easier for the physician, right? Because then they could sit at the end of the table and do whatever he's going to do. The vaginal speculum also helped them see into, this is that increased legibility of the body. The speculum, was used to spread the vagina so that they could see better into it. But I think my favorite technology of the era was the X-ray machine. So the X-ray was invented in 1895, and it kind of quickly gained a privileged place in obstetrical medicine because they would X-ray a woman when she was in labor in order to get a good picture of her pelvic structure, of her bone structure. And if they decided it was inadequate to deliver the baby, then they could perform a pubiotomy, which meant that they then clipped her pubic bone. They severed it so they could, it's easier to get a baby out that way. And they would sever her pubic bone and extract the baby. And then they would plaster the pubic bone back together and hope she recovered. A number of women were left, permanently debilitated by this. They couldn't walk properly after this kind of a procedure. Infection was rife. This was before sulfa drugs. They often had urinary difficulties after giving childbirth.
I mean, that's one of the big takeaways, I think, from the book, is that this transition from a natural thing to pregnancy being a pathogen, it means that the way women are treated is so different. How do doctors treat pain for women? Because at some stage, these procedures that you're talking about are going to cause immense pain. How do they deal with pregnant women that are in terrible pain?
Well, so and I will confess, I don't know whether this is all that was available or if it was simply their practice. Usually they would give a woman chloroform, right? Just knock her out so she doesn't make noise anymore. And what was interesting in that pain treatment, one of the things they came up with was what we knew as twilight sleep. And twilight sleep was a mixture of chloroform and scopolamine, truth serum. And while it didn't render women free of pain, it erased their memory of pain. So women could give birth and doctors could, do whatever they wanted, knowing that the woman wouldn't remember most of her experience. And interestingly enough, women themselves thought, oh, this is fabulous. I had this baby and I didn't have any pain. And so and doctors began to question, because it can really prolong labor if you give a woman too much anesthetic, including scopolamine. So they began to question the efficacy of those kind of anesthetic treatments during childbirth. But there was a campaign led by a couple of women, both in Britain and in the US, to, bring on the twilight sleep. Why shouldn't we have childbirth that was pain-free? So, and pain after childbirth was something women were supposed to deal with by being brave and by being grateful that they had a child. So there really wasn't a lot of pain medication available.
Hard to believe it's only 100 years ago, really. Well, the book Corporal Rhetoric has a chapter dedicated to Margaret Sanger as well, one of the most prominent figures of this time. Born in New York to immigrant parents, she worked as a nurse in downtown Manhattan's Lower East Side. A socialist and a feminist, she led the campaign for birth control. But what I really need to hear about Sanger, I could do a whole show on Margaret Sanger, I think, but her life seems to intersect with so many others, including those in the African-American community and in the legal profession. So can you tell us why Sanger is so important to your story?
Well, so Sanger, like like Roosevelt, is really an iconic figure for this era. Sanger predicted in Woman in the New Race that the birth control movement would be an epoch changing, an epoch, EPOCH, right? Moment in Western civilization. And in many ways, she's right. You know, the introduction of widely available and reliable, that's a key point, reliable, because there had always, I mean, since women were born, I think there have been methods of birth control, but reliable methods of birth control have changed. You know, they've changed the whole fabric of Western culture. So she was critical in ushering that in. She also she was so deeply involved in so many of the movements early on in her socialist days when she lived in New York. She had a salon that was attended regularly by leading socialists of the era, and she herself adopted the anarchist, you know, no gods, no masters, for her masthead when she was publishing The Woman Rebel. You see that socialist radicalism gradually tempered over the years as she had to build allies in order to build the birth control movement. And so she had to take on both the medical community and the legal community in order to, which, you know, were formidable fields to take on. And she was, as they would say in today's culture, just a nurse. Yeah, so Sanger was important. She took on really big battles. She also got mixed up in certain ways with the eugenics movement, although she was she was interesting. A lot of African Americans took her investment in eugenics to be a racist thing, but a number of Black feminist writers say, you know, it's kind of mixed on the record there, because she went into Black communities at the invitation of Black women club leaders who, because like white women, they wanted access to birth control too. So I'm not ready to condemn Sanger as a racist.
That's what tends to get me between the depiction of Theodore Roosevelt as this enigmatic character is mirrored very much by Sanger, who is as enigmatic. I mean, she's a eugenicist. She's not an abortion advocate. She seeks to care for women, but she also has shares some of the prevailing views about pregnancy as pathology. And she's a mother of 2 children, but she decries overpopulation. So how should we read her polemics?
Well, and she actually had 3 children. You know, one of them died. In fact, it was kind of in consideration for her grief over the loss of her daughter that they dropped the lawsuit when she returned to the U.S. So how should we read her polemics? So I think we need to remember that Margaret Sanger was a master publicist. She knew how to, and she had to be good in order to take on the big battles she fought. So she knew how to generate press. She was really good at it. And if it meant staging a scene and airing the anger, she was more than happy to do so. And in this way, by being so flamboyantly public and generating publicity anywhere, as far as Sanger was concerned, any publicity was good publicity. So I think in many ways, it was just a strategy for her. I think Sanger was probably a very thoughtful woman who generated that kind of polemic and got invested in it out of frustration and anger, and I think she deeply loved being a mother. But I also, you know, there was this part of her too who thought that motherhood was valuable to her because she chose that, and she encountered too many women that didn't necessarily choose it and couldn't afford it. I mean, this is one of the things that we know is that raising children is it's expensive. They just, they need food, they need diapers, they need daycare, they need preschool, you pay for sports. Do you know what toe shoes cost? So children are incredibly expensive adventures. And all persons will shield themselves from that kind of ongoing economic drain, particularly if they can barely feed themselves, which a lot of the women that, when Sanger worked as a nurse, those are the women that she served. And it deeply affected her understanding of reproduction and childbirth. Because without reliable birth control, women really were at the mercy of their own reproductive capacity.
I think that's fascinating, and they stop becoming independent in a sense because financially they can't be, and their children are in some ways a literal drain on them in terms of finances. There's another chapter though that you have on Gillian Gilbert, a mother of 12, who's described by one journalist as a feminist and a genius in the art of living. Can you tell me why Gilbert is important to your narrative on efficiency and how she contrasts with others like Sanger?
Oh, I love so this is interesting. I can't think of two people more different than Margaret Sanger, who was so flamboyant, and Gillian Gilbert, who was so circumspect. And they came up in very different circumstances. So Gillian Gilbert is critical to an understanding of this era. First of all, because she was very deeply involved in the efficiency movement. She and her husband, Frank, during his life, worked very closely in the early days with Taylor. And they did time and motion studies to show how to better use your body to accomplish a physical task, which Taylor made great use of. But their interest, and really you can see Lillian's interest here. She was really interested in the psychology. I mean, that was her degree was in psychology, and she applied it to industrial settings. But she was really interested in exhaustion of the body, the health of the body, and the happiness of the body. She used to talk about efficiency as something that you used in order to produce more happiness minutes. How can you get through a routine task as quickly and with the least amount of exhaustion possible so that you have more time for leisure? So she was really interested in the creation of leisure for people, which was not something that Taylor was at all interested in. And I think another key difference that Gilbert introduces to efficiency studies and to scientific management is scientific management really ranked individuals. You had the management class, that took the knowledge of how workers worked and then redistributed it in a new and alien form to their workers. Gilbert saw much more flexibility between who could be a manager and who could be a worker, and actually thought kind of everyone could manage themselves in many ways and could learn. And what she wanted to teach people was to learn for themselves how best to manage. And as you know, have you ever seen the movie The Cheaper by the Dozen?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so there's a marvelous moment in that movie where Frank Gilbert, who's the father of these children, answers the door, and it's a woman who is from the Birth Control League that wants to speak to Gillian Gilbert because she's heard that she's a management whiz, which she is, and she's a very prominent club woman at the time too. Gilbert has, and I'll talk about her pedigree in a minute. Anyhow, so Gilbert asks this woman, I think her name is Mrs. Mabane or something, and so they're having a conversation with this woman about, how important birth control is, and that she understands that Mrs. Gilbert will be just the perfect person for this, and he does his whistle that he used to marshal the children, and all the children come running down the stairs, and she's aghast. So it's that moment of confrontation between the birth control movement and this mother of 12. So Lillian Gilbert, I think, represents the positive side of eugenics. Now, Lillian Gilbert was just exactly the kind of woman Teddy Roosevelt was looking for, right? She was happy, she was healthy, she was wildly productive, but she had the means to be so. So Lillian Gilbert grew up in California. Her family was very well off. They were very well educated. She herself earned a doctorate at a time, although that was the challenge because many schools would not admit women to doctoral programs. So she had been very well, she was raised with means and the means to education. And she had the means to have a large family and support them well. She also had her mother-in-law living with her through most of her child rearing years, and she had household help. So she could carry on her work, and because she had a lot of support to do so. On the other hand, as a professional, she had to battle against the paternalism of the workplace. When Frank died, and there's the examination of the historical record makes it quite clear that she's responsible for the time and motion studies as much as Frank was, that they were truly partners in that, and that much of the writing may actually have been Lillian's, although she's not credited for it. And when she published her book, they had her publish it under her initials for her first name because they didn't want people to readily recognize that it was a woman that wrote the book. But when she went back to companies that they had worked with, after her husband died, she couldn't get a contract because she was a woman. And the Society of Engineers initially rejected her application because she was a woman, not because she hadn't contributed importantly to their work. And then she had to make a living. So she turned to domestic engineering.
Great. I mean, she's a remarkable character. I think between her and Sanger and Roosevelt, we get this picture of the progressive era that is, I think in your own words, you use anxiety quite a lot. And I wonder, do we rename the progressive era the age of anxiety? It seems like from your writing, that's what it should be called, right?
Well, so yeah, the progressive era is interesting. It's got this overlay of kind of opulence and optimism and ebullience. And then there's this undercurrent of deep anxiety about all of, the rapid changes in the makeup of the nation. We were going through massive immigration, and the people coming to our country, they weren't white.
No, I take your point. I mean, I think the anxiety that you use as a word is wonderful. And you start your book with this really horrifying quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I'm just going to briefly allude to it here, but it says that it would be better to sterilize feeble-minded people than allow them to reproduce. I mean, how have the progressive era courts played a role in reproduction, public health, and social progress, whether it's from miscegenation laws or sterilization laws? How have the courts played a role?
Well, so the courts can be progressive, but they can also be a deeply conservative force. And so in miscegenation laws, they played a deeply conservative role. Early on during the 1860s, prior to 1865, prior to the or 1864, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were not considered citizens, and so marriage between African Americans and white people was prohibited on the basis of the fact that they weren't citizens and they couldn't enter into a contract. So then they become citizens. And then the law decides that, well, it's true, they're now citizens and they can enter into a contract, but marriage is a contract of a different kind. So the courts changed the definition of marriage in order to maintain this marriage separation between the races in America. So in that case, and they upheld miscegenation laws over and over again in order to maintain, in order to conserve the supremacy of the white race in America. And then when labor laws probably the most notable case for labor laws is Muller versus Oregon. And this is an interesting case because women were on both sides of that fight. It was Florence Kelley and Josephine Goldmark that really authored the brief that was delivered by Louis Brandeis that argues for a difference in the treatment of women in the labor market. And Alice Paul and the women on the National Women's Party that argue against the differential treatment of women in the labor market. And what Goldmark and Kelley were really after was they were trying to get not equality, but equity for women, recognizing that women were already saddled with these extra domestic cares, that they had so many other things they had to attend to besides just their job, that they really needed some protections in the workplace. Alice Paul and the women in the National Women's Party recognized that once women began to be treated differently, that difference was going to be a deficit. As indeed it worked out. It took a very long time to dismantle lots of the protective labor legislation that resulted from Muller versus Oregon. So that was an interesting moment in legal cases. And then, of course, the sterilization laws, they reached the Supreme Court in 1927. Now, there had been sterilization laws on some state books and allowed it in some locales prior to that. But when the case of Carrie Buck makes it to the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes makes it a national right. He hands down the opinion from the Supreme Court, and it becomes the law of the nation that people institutionalized for being feeble-minded or socially unfit can be sterilized at the behest of the institution. And those laws remain on the books. They gradually come down. I don't think the last one was taken down, though, until the late 1970s, because persons that had been diagnosed with mental disability were routinely sterilized up through the 60s and 70s. I mean, it just became a routine thing. You make sure they don't make any more like themselves. And that, that's a completely eugenic solution there.
I mean, it's a remarkable quote to think that this is a Supreme Court justice basically writing the law of the land. And it's just an incredible book because it takes us from childbirth to to the White House, the high politics of it all, but then also to the day-to-day life of mother of 12. And it's just a remarkable book. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to explain it in greater depth. And I think it leaves a lot of questions for other historians to probe about women's studies and about medical humanities. I can't encourage everyone enough to go and pick up this book, because even in this show, we can't really delve into the depths that are there. It really is a tour de force with very, very deep research. I have to ask you, just on a personal note, how long were you researching this book? Because it's so rich.
Don't want to know.
It looks like years to me. Yeah.
It was years. I actually began some of this research like 20 years ago. And so I started it and I looked at it and I had some ideas about it. And then I got sidetracked and, took up a number of other pieces of work. And then came back to this, honest to God, I came back to it full force about 6 years ago.
I just had a look. It's 200 pages plus, then in addition to all the footnotes and indexing, 200 pages to get that much in there. It really is remarkable. And thanks so much for sharing it. Everyone should go out and buy the book. It really is wonderful.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.